Okay, we're winding up for the big event now. And we're doing the prelude to the conflict of 1762 to 63. No, these are not all of your notes. These are the ones we're covering this week. We will once again look at the early attempt to unify the colonies that was done during the French and Indian War. I sort of skipped over it. Then mercantilism, the Navigation Acts, French and Indian War, Pontiac's Rebellion, Proclamation of 1763, and these are going to lead to the seeds of the Revolution. So mercantilism will be on your next vocabulary list, by the way, but we're going to go over what it is now. On May 5th, 9th, 1754, Benjamin Franklin at the Albany Convention, I suddenly blinked on the word Albany, attempted to unify the colonies. The British government was not happy about this, but this is where his dream was born, at least. And yes, he did live to see his country, the colonies, become one unified country. So this is the first political cartoon I am showing you. This is also going to be your introduction to the PCA, Political Cartoon Analysis Worksheets. So what we have here is a very simple political cartoon, but I will do this one for you. It does say, so you look at the words, join our die. Ask yourself, well, what do I mean by this? Well, if you look at this, NE is New England, NY is New York, NJ New Jersey, R is Rhode Island, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Georgia seems to be missing. So we have a chopped up snake. What it's saying is if the colonies stay chopped up, we're dead. But unified, we're a rather deadly creature. So he, being Benjamin Franklin, did publish this in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and it was part of his attempts to once again unify the colonies. Why did we need unified? Well, in that point it was French-Indian War, but we had some other problems going on. Number one, mercantilism. It was a problem for the colonists. Mercantilism is never good for your colonists, no matter where you're colonizing. It is an economic system practiced mainly in the 17th and 18th centuries by European nations. They believed that their colonies were there for only their good, and that there was a limited amount of wealth in the world. We're going to see this as part of a problem when we go over the Industrial Revolution as well. Really, you should have gone over it last year in world history. So you may remember, this is why the Industrial Revolution, which started in Britain, went much better for the British and the Americans than it did for the French, because the French were under this same mentality that there's a finite amount of wealth in the world, and they need to hoard it. The big analysis is that they believe, there's a pie, and they're fighting for the biggest piece of that pie. The Industrial Revolution was teaching other countries that there's a second pie, and you don't need to be hoarding the wealth away from everybody else. Well, at this point, they all think there's just the one pie, and they're fighting for a piece of it, and the colonies are the biggest piece and what they can get out of it. So they believe there's a finite amount of gold and silver, which was a regulated, heavily regulated, then regulated manufacturing, trade, and production within its country and colony. So a very hands-on economic system. Great Britain, for example, would purchase raw materials from North American colonies at a low price, determined by the British government. So they decided what they'd pay. Then the colonies were required to purchase these finished goods from Britain at a higher price and set by the British government. So the North American colonies were only allowed to trade with the British Empire. So we are talking things like cotton, which is grown in the colonies. So the cotton growers were forced to send the cotton to Britain, where they would then spin it and weave it into fabric and make clothing, and then send it back at a much higher price. Well, this is stuff we could all do in the Americas. There was no reason to send it to Britain, and the colonists realized that. They knew they had the skills. This also caused a lot of smuggling in back alley, behind the curtains, in the back of the building. black market goods where they were just making it themselves, home factories. And this is going to cause a lot of problems once the British, who'd been very hands-off, as I've mentioned. Until the French and Indian War, they were not paying attention to what's going on in the Americas. Now they are. They're going to realize that some of the people, are, circumnavigating this. That includes one of my ancestors, John Hancock, who was smuggling sugar. Probably why we're all addicted to it now in my family. So this list of course leads to bitterness on the part of the colonists because, excuse me? Why are you paying me so little for my goods and then charging me so much for the finished product when I could have just done this myself? And they had very little input on their own economic policies. Once again, it's not quite taxation without representation, but they're living under an economic system where they don't have a word on what happens. They have no say. So once again, you'll see in the map, here's our colonies. Raw materials all go to the mother country. Here's Great Britain. And then the finished products are shipped back at a higher price. And it's the colonists who are paying for the sailors and the ships to ship these goods out there and then ship them back. When they just originated, you'll notice, in the colonies. Well, the British did respond to the illegal colonial trade once they figured out what was going on by passing a series of enforced laws known as the Acts of Trade and Navigation, or more commonly known as the Navigational Acts. Beginning in 1651, these acts restrict colonial trade in various ways. All goods traded to and from the North American colonies had to be shipped in either colonial or British ships. So they could not, just have the Spanish help them or the French, because, look, if it's going to stick it to the British, the French will do it. Just a clue as to why they joined the American Revolution. It's not that they so greatly believed in our cause, as they really liked sticking it to the British. All crews of these ships had to be at least 75% British or colonial, so you couldn't even hire that many people who are not a British citizen. And certain products, tobacco, sugar, rice, molasses, and furs, which once again come from the Americas, could be sold from colonies to Britain, only to them. So we got all this land from New France, which you're going to see in a minute we can't even settle, but they had been fur traders. So we have all this fur trade. We're growing the tobacco, we're growing the sugar, we're growing the rice, the molasses. It's all coming from us, and we can only trade with Britain. These goods are traded between colonies in Europe, had to be unloaded in a British port. So if you are a colonist in New York, and you want maple syrup from New Hampshire, because the maple syrup, the sap comes, well, it's up in Canada too, but New Hampshire will say you can buy fresh maple syrup there. You have to buy it from Britain, even though you could drive that in one day. It took less time for them to just go to New Hampshire themselves, get it, and come back. No, they were not allowed. So then we have the French-Indian War in 1756 to 1763, also known as the 7-Year War. France lost most of its overseas empire. Once again, you should remember that from the previous notes. All this area right here was New France. It goes pretty much to England, except the port of New Orleans. So how do we end up with New Orleans? Hit one word: Napoleon. So the size of the British holds in the North America doubled with the acquisition of the Canadian territory in the area east of the Mississippi River. The British Treasury went deep into debt, of course, to pay for the war. But don't get it wrong. If it weren't the French, they probably wouldn't have been so helpful. And they tried to pay it by taxing the American colonies. So you know what? We're going to win this war, and the colonists are going to pay for it, which led to resentment by the colonists towards Britain, because in this case they could enforce that. While the British saw their empire grow substantially, it became increasingly difficult to manage such a large territorial area, which is a big concern. The United States is huge, But even just the area east of the Mississippi is extremely large. It is. And they did not have the communication devices to pull this off. So Britain became the dominant world power at the time. They're on top. Well, after the war, shortly, Pontiac, who was a Native American chieftain, formed a confederation of various tribes in the region to protect their lands from the encroaching British settlers. They got along well with the French, but the French respected them. The British, remember, this goes back to the Puritan belief that God gave us all of the Americas for us, and the natives just happened to be on our land. Well, after this, the British are coming in. They do not like it. The British General Jeffrey Amherst violated a treaty agreement they had with Pontiac, and Pontiac's Confederacy started attacking forts. The ones on the Western Front. The most notable is Fort Detroit. Yes, this is a picture of Fort Detroit. And if you're wondering where Fort Detroit is, it is the city of Detroit now. That's Michigan, by the way. So the rebellion ends. The British spent a whole lot more money now putting down the rebellion. And they responded to Pontiac's rebellion with 2 separate military campaigns from Pennsylvania to retake the forces of Pontiac. Pontiac could have won if he could have gotten the other tribes from west of the Mississippi to join him, which he tried. And the other tribes are like, oh no, they're not going to cross the river. They're not going to cross this great river. We're fine. So most of his Confederacy does surrender, but Pontiac resisted and only surrenders in 1766 after 3 years. Well, part of that is because of the proclamation of 1763. Keep in mind, we just went to war over the disputed land west of the Appalachian Mountains. It was the Ohio Valley is west of the Appalachians. The Allegheny and Monongahela rivers joined to form the Ohio River in what is now Pennsylvania. So just keep in mind, that's what we were fighting about. It's west of the Appalachians. I know because I grew up on the Ohio, but in Ohio. So faced with the difficult task of guarding a much larger empire in the New World, George III issued the Proclamation of 1763. Make sure this is in your notes. This restricted settlement to the east of the line drawn at the Appalachian Mountains on the map, and the red line signifies the western boundary for the British colonial settlement, right here. Notice, this puts us right back to the land we had before the war. And the proclamation also sought to stop the only difference is, we can now go up into Nova Scotia. And the proclamation also sought to stop the exploitive sale of Indian land. So yes, the colonies, Virginia and Pennsylvania, were selling land. And the purpose of the proclamation was to prevent further Indian frontier warfare after Pontiac's rebellion. So the British decided they couldn't afford it. Oh, guess what they're going to have to be doing soon. So by 1763, the British Empire is the world's superpower, stretching nearly all the way around the world, yet we're not the only ones they were colonizing. They had India and Australia, parts of Asia. The sun didn't set on that empire. In defeating the French, they now, of course, had a position of dominance. However, the status came from the substantial prize William Pitt, the Secretary of State, whose sole charge of the Directory of the War of Foreign Affairs put the British economy on shaky ground. So in order to pay for the wars, the British Crown found itself looking for new ways to levy taxes on its citizens, both at home and in its North American colonies. Once again, they'd ignored the Americas for a couple hundred years. As long as they were sending the goods, they were leaving them alone. Now you want to tax them. Well, think about it. How would you feel? How would your parents feel if suddenly they were getting tax after tax after tax on things they've never had to pay tax on? I had a fit when I moved to Arizona and had to pay tax on food. Okay, I threw a fit the first time I moved to Utah to go to college and had to pay for food, tax on food. Because Ohio, it's something necessary for life. And unless it's a junk food, they don't tax it. And don't get me started on the water. So the colonists felt they were entitled to the same rights of representation as their fellow citizens in the mother country. So they didn't say, no, you can't tax us. They said, if you are going to tax us, we want equal say in what's being taxed. That's all we're asking for, is a seat at the table. And Parliament said no. So now they're going, well, you won't even let us have a say. You won't let us in Parliament. And you're just going to add tax after tax in this act. And then you're trying to tell us we can't live west of the Appalachians. Oh, and by the way, there were people already living west of the Appalachians, which you should remember from citizenship. So those people were forced to move back to the east of the Appalachians. They were kicked off their own land. They were thrown out of their own houses. So at this time, they felt mistreated, but the feelings would soon swell to outright revolution. So for part 1 of this, you need to remember mercantilism, the Enlightenment ideas, which we really haven't gotten into, the Great Awakening, which I hate skipping, but usually have to. So those two, okay, not a big deal. Mercantilism, oh, that was a big deal. By the way, the Great Awakening is a religious movement where people became very religious again. So the Puritanism died, but then there's the Great Awakening. Everybody's going to church again. There are 2 Great Awakenings. The one that several of you might have heard about is the one in the 1840s. This is the first one. So restrictive laws passed by the British, not happy about that. You're telling me who I can hire on my ships. You're taxing me. In the French and Indian War. And there's also a population explosion. And these guys have been self-ruling, basically. We've been free. We've been ruling ourselves. And suddenly you want this. Think about it as your parents suddenly, you're growing up, you're fine. You have no curfew. I grew up without a curfew. It was a negotiation. My mother would ask me when I'd be home. I'd tell her. If she didn't like the answer, she'd tell me to try again. And we're talking about, I said 4 o'clock in the morning, and she said try again. And I said 2 o'clock in the morning, and the answer was, okay. She trusted me. My younger sister, however, not so trustworthy. She got a curfew. But this would be like my mother deciding all her children had to have a curfew. My younger brother used to try to keep it secret from me that it came out, and he was so embarrassed that he didn't have a curfew. I had to explain to him, no, I didn't, you didn't, just the sibling between us did. And she needed one. So we are going to get back on this video to discuss the direct and indirect taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Sons of Liberty, the Stamp Act Congress, the Committees of Correspondence, the Declaratory Act, the Townsend Act, and the Writs of Assistance. You will notice several of these were on your vocabulary list. Some of the rest will be on the next vocabulary list. Have fun with it.